This episode is all about Francis Ford Coppola. Well, at least about one of his famous quotes. In 1979, Francis Ford Coppola directed and co-wrote Apocalypse Now, the Vietnam War film that not only explores the horror of war, but the darkness of man. The film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes that year, and many other film awards. Regardless of its post-production success, the filming of Apocalypse Now famously endured many grueling hardships, like 238 days of principal shooting in the jungle, monsoons, Martin Sheen's heart attack, an unprepared Marlon Brando, just to name a few. Apocalypse Now is considered to be one of the greatest films ever made. This is, of course, based on its writing, directing, acting, cinematography, and technical achievements of its time. But I would argue one of the reasons this film is so beloved is due in part because of Eleanor Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola's wife. During the making of Apocalypse Now, Eleanor kept diaries of the mayhem and shot her own vivid behind-the-scenes footage that allowed the audience and film lovers to really get a feel for what it was like in those moments. Her brilliant film footage was produced as its own film in 1991 called Hearts of Darkness, A Filmmaker's Apocalypse. In this documentary film about the making of Apocalypse Now, we as viewers are able to see firsthand the toll that this film took on everyone involved. We see an extremely stressed out Francis Ford Coppola and all the insane adversities that took place during the making of this masterpiece. Since this is a podcast about the connections between Ohio and Hollywood, there is one quote from the Hearts of Darkness documentary that has always stuck out to me.
To me, the great hope is that now these little 8mm video recorders and stuff are coming around. Some just people who normally wouldn't make movies are going to be making them. And, suddenly one day some little fat girl in Ohio is going to be the new Mozart, and make a beautiful film with her little father's camera recorder. And for once, the so-called professionalism about movies will be destroyed forever, and it'll really become an art form.
This famous quote has intrigued me for years. Why a little fat girl? And why is she from Ohio? And is there a negative spin to this quote or not? In order to figure this out, I interviewed 3 guests to hash it out with me. The voices you'll hear in this episode are Kate Hagen, who is a writer and producer living in Los Angeles. Her work has appeared in Playboy, Letterboxd, XO Jane, and beyond. She's also been working with The Blacklist since 2013, where she started as a scriptreader. Hagen is now a senior vice president at The Blacklist.
It's fascinating, right? I remember the first time I discovered that quote in college, and I was like, I'm sorry, is he talking about me? What is going on, Francis?
Kate also hails from Cincinnati, Ohio. The other voice you'll hear is that of
Rodney Hill. I'm a professor in the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication at Hofstra University, and I teach film studies here. And my areas of research have tended to include particular filmmakers. So one of those filmmakers that I've focused on has been Francis Coppola.
And last we hear from Melissa Baumgart, a writer and teacher from New York City. Melissa wrote a fantastic piece for Bright Wall, Dark Room about Eleanor Coppola and her documentary. Melissa also grew up in Cleveland, Ohio.
And I think when I heard it, I just felt like, that could be me. Growing up in Ohio and wanting very much to be connected with Hollywood and New York, and it just really spoke to me.
In order to set the scene, Hofstra film professor Rodney Hill and I discussed Francis Ford Coppola as a filmmaker, and specifically dove into Apocalypse Now. Can you give us a context of his impact in the cinematic world?
Wow, how much time do you have?
I know.
Coppola's impact on the cinematic world is tremendous, and I think he's one of the most interesting filmmakers who's still working, and maybe one of the greatest living filmmakers. And his career has been sort of twofold. He's really known for his major successes, the blockbusters like The Godfather Part 2, Apocalypse Now. But there's also a very independent strain in his work, and so he's really always had sort of a love-hate relationship with the Hollywood establishment. Right, he can make really great films that do well and are tremendous hits, Oscar-winning films like The Godfather. But I think he would rather make something on a much smaller scale and much more personal in nature. And so he's, I think he's an inspiring filmmaker in that way, that whatever he sets out to do, he can do it very well. So he knows Hollywood genres very well. He loves that kind of cinema. Clearly, he still has an impact on young filmmakers. The students who are coming through my classes, they all know Coppola's work. They're all still really in awe of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now and his other work when they discover it.
It's an incredible film, on its own. But then you watch the 1991 Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse, the documentary by Faxbar, Elena Coppola, and George Hickenlooper. It peels back the layers of madness, of, insanity, of, what was, 238 days of shooting in the jungle. And, it's interesting because the whole time he thinks he can't do it. You as a film scholar watching him as a creator, what kind of things bubble up when you view that?
Well, this is a film that I love to share with my students after they've seen Apocalypse Now and they've seen what a masterpiece it is. It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, which is one of the top prizes in the world for a film. And it is really instructive to see the mental anguish that Mr. Coppola was going through during the production of that film, and that he felt it was just going to be a piece of garbage. He thought it was, you see all this in the documentary. He says, "Oh my, this is just so pretentious. This is going to be the end of me." I think it's very instructive to see that the geniuses, and I do think of Coppola as having achieved genius at certain points in his career, they have as much self-doubt as anybody else. And so I think it's inspiring maybe for film students and future filmmakers to see that. And maybe it gives people the courage to soldier on through a difficult creative process if they ultimately believe in what they're doing.
Melissa Baumgard and I talk about the importance of Eleanor Coppola's documentary.
It's such a great documentary for people who are creative or who want to be creative, who want to make things, who want to take risks, because it shows you this famously disastrous film. Like it was reported on in the press, Apocalypse When. Like he was so behind. There were so many problems. Martin Sheen had a heart attack. And Martin Sheen wasn't even the first lead.
Right. Marlon Brando didn't know his lines. And
yeah. It's just there were so many problems with the filming, but, you're watching this with the benefit of time. So that, and it also opens at Cannes. It opens at the Cannes Film Festival. So that they've made it through the jungle, basically. And they have succeeded. This film has won 1 million awards. It's made a lot of money. It's it's legendary. But you can see from the Eleanor Coppola footage and her diaries and stuff, they don't know that it's going to turn out that way. And I think that's really appealing for people who write or who create to watch. It's very comforting because you can watch them have these highs and lows and be completely lost. And you're like, okay, well, they found the ending. They figured it out. The only way out is through.
Ohio itself has another meaningful representation in Apocalypse Now, which I analyze with Hofstra professor Rodney Hill. The very first words that Kurtz and Willard, so Marlon Brando's character is Kurtz and Marty Sheen's character is Willard, the very first words they say to each other, Kurtz asks, "Where are you from?" And Willard says, "I'm from Ohio, sir." So I just thought that was really interesting. Not only was that their first words to get together, but that wasn't in the shooting script. So I'm assuming that part was really ad lib.
That's a good question. I would have to go back and dig around and do a little research to say for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me because so much of Brando's dialogue was ad-libbed. And that's another thing that I really admire about Coppola. He finally, as you see in the documentary, he finally realizes, oh my God, Brando hasn't even read the novella. He has no idea what this story is even about. So now what do I do? And, he's got Brando for a fixed amount of time. And if they go over, I think it's an extra $1 million that he's going to owe Brando or something. I may have that figure wrong, but it's that this big bonus in salary if he goes over the set amount of time for shooting. So eventually Coppola realizes, okay, I've just got to work with this ad-libbed dialogue and see where this takes us.
Peeling back the layers a little bit, character development, why do you think that Captain Willard being from Ohio matters? Like, what does that sort of set the scene for?
Well, it does tie into, I think there's a well-worn stereotype, not only of Ohio, but of, say, the Midwest in general, Middle America, sort of standing for a kind of idealized vision of American life and American values, right? And so the fact that Willard being from Ohio leads into the story about the river and the gardenia plantation, maybe as a touchstone for a certain stereotypical view of morality, or I don't want to say small town values, but the Midwest generally has been used in film in that way, I think, throughout film history, as being kind of emblematic of, if there is any such thing as an American set of values or a stereotypical American set of values, we tend to sort of locate it in the Midwest, maybe.
Right.
It's an idea of America
I think
that probably never really existed. It's this idealized fantasy of this locus of American values. But I do think there's something about that going on here. And it may be just a happy accident that they mentioned Ohio. And with Martin Sheen being from Ohio himself, maybe he just responded. I don't know. That could have all been ad-libbed as well.
Right. Yeah, that's very true.
But he's not from Toledo. Sheen, I think, is from Dayton, Ohio.
It's from Dayton, exactly. Yeah.
So why he said Toledo, I don't know.
Right. That would be so interesting to know for sure. I guess the only people that would really know would be Mr. Coppola and Martin Sheen, really. And now it's time to unpack the Francis Ford Coppola That Girl in Ohio quote itself. Let's listen to Kate Hagen's take. I want to sort of unpack, why he chose those words. And of course, we can't get into his head, but, what are your thoughts?
I remember the first time I discovered that quote in college, and I was like, I'm sorry, is he talking about me? Like, what is going on, Francis? I think, it probably comes from a real place within him too. Again, I don't want to speak for Francis and how he sort of self-identifies, but I do think he is somebody who existed in a larger body for a great deal of his life, and probably sort of understands that, fat girls in Ohio have a lot to say and a lot of insight as people who are not sort of in the spotlight 100% of the time. And I think, he is able to sort of talk about sort of reframing cinema through that gaze and that truly kind of independent spirit, truly unique perspectives we haven't seen before. It's so interesting too, because I can totally see where people would read that quote and see it as something negative of well, a dumb farm fat girl from Ohio can make movies. But I don't know. I don't see it that way at all. I think he's sort of empowering a generation of filmmakers to just be go make your movie. But I have wondered over the years why that specific word choice, why that specificity. One of my favorite running jokes is to talk with friends whenever people are like, I'm from the Midwest. I'm like, okay, is it Ohio or Michigan? Because I find that a lot of the Midwesterners out here are specifically from Ohio or Michigan. No shade to Indiana or Illinois, but that is very much how it sort of breaks down. But yeah, if I ever meet him, that is certainly the thing I'm going to ask him about. I'm like, yeah. Godfather, schmodfather. Like, let's talk about this quote, Francis. Yeah.
So, Rodney, what is your educated inference about this quote?
Well, that's a good question. I take it as a very positive statement all around. Coppola, like myself, at least at that time, he was kind of a hefty guy. So when he says a little fat girl from Ohio, I don't think he means that in any kind of pejorative way, right? Again, maybe using Ohio as, obviously it's not Hollywood, it's not New York. So it's undercutting this idea that to make movies, you have to be in Hollywood, you have to be part of this huge corporate system where all the ideas go through committees, and by the time a film actually gets made, it doesn't look anything like the vision of the person who came up with the idea. So somebody you've never heard of before in the middle of the country will be able to make films. And of course, I mean, we've seen this come to fruition. And who knows, I mean, I think we have yet to see the potential of this democratization of the medium, right? Anybody now can make a film on your phone, and you can get editing software very cheaply and mixing and all that. So it really has been democratized to a great extent, and maybe we'll see some great potential come out of that. So I think that's what he was trying to get at, that somebody could simply use motion pictures for a very personal, individual kind of expression without having to have huge, corporate backing. And out of that might come a very poetic approach to the medium, perhaps. Mr. Coppola has always been about 20 years at least ahead of his time in terms of thinking about technology. He was predicting electronic cinema around that same time as well. He predicted that cinema would be digital and that editing would be done digitally. He was making those predictions well before those things actually happened. And I'm not sure anybody really took him very seriously. And then it all turns out to be correct. And I think his comment about the young woman from Ohio is probably turns out to be correct as well. So I think he's, just looking at the future potentialities of the medium.
Melissa Bumgard rounds out thoughts on the fat girl in Ohio quote.
I think it's interesting that he sort of ends this movie saying, like, there are other voices than mine, and like, I'm not doing this just like, it's sort of like, I'm not doing this just so you can see my movie. I'm doing this so like people see lots of movies and hear lots of different voices. And I don't know. I think it's very cool that he's sort of saying like, well, there will be other people that are going to be making movies too. And that's really what elevates it to art.
I'm so grateful to Rodney Hill, Kate Hagen, and Melissa Bumgard for helping me analyze this famous Francis Ford Coppola quote, and to finally understand it to be unquestionably positive. So, cheers. Cheers to the little fat girl in Ohio. May we be her, may we raise her, and may we empower her to make films and to tell her stories. This episode was edited by me, Liz Paul, and engineered by Adam Rich for WOUB Public Media at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. Visit our show notes where we link to Kate Hagen's letterbox essay, Fat Girls on Film, and Melissa Bumgard's article, You Have to Fail a Little for Bright Wall, Dark Room. If you like this podcast, please share it widely, tell your friends about it, and feel free to give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. And follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. As always, thanks for listening.